Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna get started here. Hopefully some more people will join us as we move through, but for those that are here, welcome. Hopefully you've all had a chance to see the things posted here about keeping your microphones muted. There are a lot of people on the call tonight, so we get a lot of feedback if more than one person has their mic on. So you can type in questions in the chat box, and I will stop a couple of times and review the questions that are in there and answer them as we move through the evening. If you're having trouble with your connections, generally if you turn your video camera off, you can get a stronger internet connection. And worst comes to worst, leave the call and come back on is usually what it takes, unfortunately, as we've probably all learned dealing with this technology. Slides are stuck. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I am Kristy Morley. I am the Senior Naturalist here at Wissahickon Trails, and we are going to talk about fireflies tonight. For those who are not familiar with who we are, we were formerly Wissahickon Watershed Association. We recently changed our name to Wissahickon Trails. We are still an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania. We've been around for a little over 60 years. And we really work to protect the land and water of the upper area of the Wissahickon Creek, so Montgomery County, basically. And we work in partnership with the folks in Philadelphia who maintain the lower end of the Wissahickon. We ourselves have saved nearly 1,300 acres of land from development and own and manage 12 nature preserves and 25 miles of trails, 24 miles of trails. So if you are not a supporter of ours currently, I encourage you to go take a look at our website, wishickontrails.org. There's a lot of information about the projects that we work on, the programs that we have, as well as an interactive trail map so you can see what all of our preserves and our trail access points are. For those of you who already are supporters of us, my personal thanks to you. Since we are a nonprofit organization, we really do depend on our supporters. And so we really appreciate those people who are currently supporting us and our work. So an outline for tonight, we are going to talk a little bit about firefly ecology. Then I'm going to talk about how to identify different species of fireflies, a little bit about threats and conservation, and then some citizen science projects that you might be interested in doing because you can do them from the comfort of your own backyard or a local park or old field or whatever that you might have access to. And then also talk a little bit about some additional resources that if you're interested in learning more about fireflies, you might want to take a look at. So, but before I jump into the ecology, I just want to take a second to talk about why fireflies. I mean, they're cool, they're great, they're fun to watch, and it's a great way to spend a summer evening. But the reality is that fireflies are actually pretty important little creatures, and we probably don't give them enough credit a lot of the times. So let's start with a few of the reasons why they're so important. Because of their life cycle requirements, which we're going to talk about in a second, they're a really good indicator of the health of an environment. They will be reduced in number or even disappear when an environment isn't up to snuff. So we can use them as a good immediate indicator that things are kind of imbalanced in the environment if they're there and they're in good numbers. They are both predators and prey. So they play a very important role in the middle of food webs and contributing to that stability of food webs above and below them for other species. And they actually have a number of applications in medicine and science and industry. And some of this is historical, but it's continued to be used to this day, although where historically we actually used to have to go out and collect fireflies to harness the chemicals that we needed from them, we have now figured out how to make those chemicals synthetically so they serve the same purpose. So we can leave the fireflies in the environment where they belong. But part of what gives fireflies their glow is an enzyme called luciferase, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that does in the rest of the presentation. But that particular enzyme has been harnessed in a number of medical tests, and it helps scientists observe interactions between cells. So they've actually used it to look at understanding how HIV was transmitted, and also helps in the detection of blood clots. And it's used in a number of tests that actually look for bacterial contamination in milk and meat and the blood that we donate to other people to make sure that it's fresh. And other industry researchers now are currently studying how to create advances in lighting that, because fireflies will produce light with very little heat. And most of our light sources have heat that come along with them. So there's a lot of potential applications for being able to create light sources that produce less heat or even no heat ultimately. And so researchers continue to look at fireflies to help us understand those things. So I'm going to jump into firefly ecology now. And first, let's start off with what is a firefly. So some of you may call them lightning bugs. Some of you may call them fireflies. They are one and the same thing. They're terms that are essentially used interchangeably in the United States. Lightning bug tends to be more southern and firefly more northern, but that's not really true. Most of us call them whatever our parents call them, and we just call them that for the rest of our lives. Excuse me. But despite both of the names that are commonly used in the United States, firefly or lightning bug, they are neither flies nor bugs. So let's take a step back for a minute and talk about insect orders. And orders are really just a high-level way of grouping related organisms together. So humans, us, are in the order primate with monkeys and apes. And orders just contain a variety of genuses and species that share evolutionary histories and similar characteristics. So here are some of the orders of insects. These are not all of them, but these are some of the main ones. And you may recognize a couple of these here, like the Lepidoptera. These are butterflies and moths. We have Neuropta up here, the dragonflies. Orthoptera, these are crickets and grasshoppers. And then we have Diptera, which are the flies. And flies are distinct because they have a single pair of wings versus some other bugs that have two pairs of wings, like the butterflies and moths and the dragonflies. Forgive me for the scientific names of these. They're going to get me tongue-tied. The true bugs, they're insects that actually suck fluid from plants to eat. So that's what characterizes something as a true bug in the orders of insects. Fireflies are actually beetles. So they sit down here in this order, and we'll talk about what some of the characteristics are in the next couple of slides about what beetles have in common and why fireflies fit into that category. But then to just further confuse things about the naming conventions of firefly or lightning bugs, not all of them actually fly, and not all of them actually light up. And we're going to talk about some of the distinctions that are made between the different species for those that don't fly and those that don't light up, but they are still actually fireflies. So, as I said, fireflies are beetles, and one of the very particular structures that all beetles have, and this is why fireflies are in this group, is that they have what's known as a hardened forewing. This is the technical scientific name for it. Just think of it as a protective covering over their wings. So it's this piece here, if you can see my slider, my pointer here, this protects the wings underneath. So in essence, fireflies and other beetles actually do have two pairs of wings, but they don't really use this top level, this hardened level, for flying. It does serve a little bit for balance when they're in the air, but basically it opens up, they stay still, and these back wings that you see in this right-hand picture are the ones that actually make the insect fly. The other thing that fireflies have that's pretty unique to them is this head shield. So on this firefly on the leaf here, it's this rounded piece that comes over their head and over their eyes. And you can just barely see one eye peeking out here on the lower left-hand side under that head shield. In some cases, in some species of fireflies, you can't ever see their eyes when they're at rest. That head shield, or pronotum, gets pulled back, so you can kind of see it on the back side of the flying insect, the flying firefly over here, pulled back so their head and their eyes stick out when they fly so they can see where they're going. And this is one of the characteristics that makes a firefly, is this particular head shield piece that they have. And so even in the ones that don't light up and the ones that don't fly, they still have this head shield structure. They have the same characteristics as other insects, 3 segments, so the head with the antenna, the thorax with the 3 pairs of legs, and then the abdominal section. And in fireflies that flash, the last couple of segments of their abdomen are where their lantern is located. So this plain yellow piece down here is where they will light up, and it is technically called their lantern. So let's talk a little bit about their life cycle. So like all beetles and a lot of other insects, fireflies undergo complete metamorphosis. So they don't start out looking anything like what they end up like as an adult, just like butterflies and moths. So we've seen what the adult looks like in the previous slide, and we're going to start our journey with the adult. Most adults only live about 3 to 4 weeks, and for the most part, they don't eat during that time. Their sole biological imperative is to find a mate or multiple mates to pass on their genetic legacy. Once a female has mated, she lays eggs, and depending on the species, those eggs are either laid singly or in groups. A couple of the species, the females will actually guard the eggs for as long as she lives. But in most cases, the eggs are just laid and left alone to fend for themselves. Firefly eggs are really tiny. We're talking about 1 millimeter in size, which is, slightly bigger than a period at the end of a sentence, smaller than a 0, a typical type 0 would be. So they're very small. They do actually glow faintly, but because they're so small, it's actually really difficult to see that with your naked eye. So don't think that you're just going to go out. So typically eggs are laid in like mossy areas or in leaf litter or in tree crevices under a log, that kind of thing. But it's not something that you're just going to be able to go out and find a pile of glowing eggs in the woods. They're so small and they don't glow very much. So it's really hard. It really takes magnification or some long exposure photography to really see the level of glow on them. And on average, those eggs hatch in about 3 weeks. The larval stage is really where the firefly spends most of its life. It can last 1 to 2 years, depending on the species and the climate. So in the southern part of the United States, some of these life cycle processes go a lot faster than they do here in the northern part. We're going to call ourselves the northern part of the country, and even longer further up into Canada than I have on this chart. But on average, this is kind of about where they're at. Firefly larvae, as shown here, are kind of worm-like, if you will, but they have all of these segments on their bodies, and they have the head shield, as you can see here. The fireflies that are laying in our yards this summer, they won't be adults until either the summer of 2021 or 2022, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it, that this tiny little thing, maybe 1 inch long, can survive that long in the soil. And that's where most of them stay, is underground. There are a few that are a little bit more terrestrial and will wander around in the grass, leaf litter, or up trees. And sometimes you can see them. There are even a few that are semi-aquatic at this stage, and so they will live in and out of water sources. All larvae glow. And so, and this is one of those other things that categorizes these particular insects as fireflies. Even if their adult versions don't glow, their adult versions might not glow, but the larval stage will. And that's what categorizes it as a firefly. Most larvae do not have fully formed lanterns. They cannot really control the glow. So they're kind of either on or off. They don't flash like adults do. And they don't usually have a full like abdominal section of them dedicated to the lantern. It's usually, you can see here, these two lighter yellow patches at the tail end of this larva. This is where the light would come from on this particular larva. And so usually it's only a couple of little spots at their tail end that will glow. Some species, a lot of the larva itself will glow, but for the most part, it's fixed at the tail end. One of the things that's really interesting about larvae is they are absolutely voracious eaters. They eat worms and snails and slugs and caterpillars and other soil-dwelling invertebrates, just about anything that they can get their little teeth into, because they do kind of have little teeth under there. And they're very well equipped to deal with these kinds of things and prey that is much larger than them. If you think about a snail or even an earthworm in comparison to this small larval stage here of this firefly. So when they bite prey, the first bite that they have actually injects a numbing agent into their prey. And the second bite, if you will, it actually injects paralyzing neurotoxins. And so they can secure their prey and feed on things that are several times their size because they've basically adapted to having a way to hold that prey still. And so they need to eat enough in this stage to get them through their entire pupal stage, which we'll talk about in a minute, and their adult stage. So as you can imagine, they spend a lot of time eating. They will go sort of dormant in the winter when it gets colder and things aren't moving around as much. But if they have the opportunity to eat during that time, they will, if they're in a slightly warmer environment. Excuse me. And so that's all they do is eat. When they become a pupa at the end of their larval stage, they start to look something like this. And they look a little different for every species, but this is the last stage before the adult emerges. And so this is equivalent to a chrysalis in a butterfly or a cocoon in a moth. It's that stage. So they're almost an adult. You can start to see a lot of the adult structures, like the abdominal structure here where the lantern will be. This picture is a little small, but you can start to see the outlines of their wings here, which you can't really see in the larval stage. You begin to see the more defined head shield and their eyes underneath. And they really sort of start to look much more like a firefly. So this larva was a larva that pupa, excuse me, this pupa was one I actually found in my backyard a couple of weeks ago. I was moving some pots of plants that were out there, and it was in the dirt underneath the pot of plants. And so I took some pictures of it and was able to indeed prove that because it was going to rain, I put it into a plastic container with air holes inside and brought it inside because I wanted to see what would happen. And they do indeed glow. So this is a picture, and I know it's not a great picture, but this is a picture of that pupa. And so you can see its tail end is glowing there in advance of it becoming an adult firefly. So once they emerge as adults, like other beetles and moths and butterflies, they actually need a little bit of time to harden and dry out before they're actually able to fly, but that usually happens in a couple of hours. And then they go about their merry way as an adult butterfly, an adult firefly. So I want to talk really quickly about bioluminescence, and this is actually a really complicated topic. So I don't want to like send anybody back to high school chemistry or college chemistry or anything like that. So we're going to cover this kind of at a really high level, but I do have a resource at the end that if you're interested in more information on this, it's a really good reference and has a lot of interesting factoids about fireflies and their ability to bioluminesce. So bioluminescence, just the ability to make light like this. Fireflies aren't the only creatures that do this. There's fungi and mushrooms and eels and a bunch of other things that have bioluminescent capabilities, but they are one of only a few that are capable of very precisely controlling their bioluminescent output, particularly as adults. So that makes them somewhat unique in the animal kingdom. So in short, the bioluminescence is a chemical reaction that happens in these photocyte cells, which live in the lantern. So if we're looking at this, the top of the picture is essentially the inside of the firefly, and the bottom of the picture is the outside of the firefly. So there's a layer of protective cells here that cover the photocytes, and the chemical reaction that makes them glow happens in these cells. And basically, there's a couple of things that they have to make this happen. They have to have the enzyme luciferase, which I mentioned before. They have to have the substrate luciferin for the enzyme to act on. And then they also have to have oxygen, magnesium, and ATP, which powers, the ATP powers the cells to do this. There's a multi-step reaction, chemical reaction that happens when all of these things get together, and that produces energy, and then we see that energy and they use that energy as light. The reflector cells at the base of the lantern, so on the inside of the body of the firefly, if you will, they intensify and direct the light. So it makes it brighter, a little bit brighter, and pushes it outwards so that it's visible to be seen. The interesting thing about this is that all of this is under control by the nervous system of the firefly. So we're going to see in a little bit that different species create different flash patterns, and that level of control is achieved because all of this is directly under the control of the nervous system. So there are receptors in the brain that connect to the photocyte cells that tell the firefly when to flash, how long to flash, and those kinds of things. And so that makes them somewhat unique among, as I said, among the animal kingdom, because they can precisely control that output. The other thing that's really unique about their ability to produce this light is that it is, depending on the sources that you look at, between 90 to 98% efficient in producing cold light. So they lose very little of their energy as heat. In contrast, an incandescent light bulb like that we would have sitting in our living room loses almost 90%, 97% of its energy as heat. Only 3% of its energy is actually used for light. So they are extraordinarily efficient in producing this light and not having it lost as heat. The downside to this, and it has some knock-on effects for how we view them, is that each individual firefly isn't very bright. So if you only see one firefly flashing at a time, and depending on the lightness of the sky, it may not seem really bright. If you have a lot of fireflies flashing at the same time, it can seem much brighter. And that's just, you know, the cumulative effect. But this is also why it's difficult for us to understand how to harness some of the chemical processes that they use to be able to make our own light, because while it might be, they might be extremely efficient, it's not very bright. So it's not something that we can directly use in any applications for ourselves. Although, as I said in the beginning, researchers continue to do that, to study that, to understand how we might learn more about that. So that's just a really quick overview without getting too tied up in the chemistry of this, but it is actually a chemical reaction that happens in their cells that they can control. So why do they flash? So here's a picture of a firefly flashing as it's flying. Why do they do this? Well, the #1 reason that they do this is to find a mate. And typically in most species, the males are the ones that are flying and flashing while they're flying, and the females tend to remain stationary and answer the males with their own flash. And so when you're watching fireflies fly around your yard, most of those fireflies that you are seeing are males as they're flying around. And they are searching for the female that might be down in the grass or on a leaf, and trying to watch for when she flashes to let them know that she's there. The other reason that they might do this is to lure in a meal. In some species of fireflies, there is an assassin of epic proportions. Certain species of females will lure in males of other species by mimicking their flash patterns. So, and then they prey on them. They can also steal meals from other females that are doing this. And they can simply pounce on other fireflies if they come across while they're out there. So if there's a female firefly that's in the grass that they happen to find, or they're on a leaf and they find another firefly on a leaf, they may attack that firefly. And the main reason why it's believed that they do this is that they gain defensive chemicals that they can't make to protect themselves and their eggs. And we'll talk a little bit about those in a minute, but that these particular species of fireflies don't make those chemicals themselves. And so by ingesting them from other fireflies, they get enough to protect themselves for their short life cycle and then protect their eggs through their times. So this is a picture of one that I actually captured at our Crossways Preserve. And so this species of firefly, the big one here, is a Photorus firefly. And it's actually eating a much smaller Lucidota firefly. And it just was on the leaf of a milkweed plant, happily having a meal one morning when I was out there. So it does happen. And the last reason that they flash is to warn off predators. So the flashing sends a warning to predators that I don't taste good, don't eat me. So as I mentioned, there's a number of chemicals, and the fireflies contain a whole bunch of different chemicals in their blood that are bitter tasting and actually toxic. And so if it has been shown in lab studies that if a predator were to eat enough fireflies, it could actually get poisoned by the toxic chemicals in those fireflies. Now, most predators don't do that in nature. The flashing and the fireflies will actually like emit a drop of blood if a predator hits them that tastes bitter, and so it would potentially make the predator let go because it tastes bad. And they also can emit a distinctive odor. If you've ever caught a firefly and been a little rough with it, you might notice a really weird, odd, strong smell. That's actually the firefly's defense mechanism. It thinks you're a giant predator, and it's releasing its chemicals that make it smell bad as a warning that I taste bad, don't eat me, and leave me alone. And for us as humans, catching a couple of fireflies and potentially having them do that isn't, it's not great for the firefly, but it's not really going to hurt us to do it. But interactions with birds and things like that, like if birds won't eat fireflies, if they try as young birds that aren't aware of I need to be paying attention that this tastes bad, they'll often eat it and then regurgitate it right back up because of the defense mechanisms of the fireflies. Now, I mentioned earlier that they are a prey species, and the biggest thing that preys on fireflies is actually spiders. A variety of spiders, daddy long legs, and bugs called assassin bugs. They actually will prey on fireflies, and they've developed mechanisms to get around the chemical defenses of the fireflies. And then one last note about dark fireflies. So I mentioned in the beginning that there are some fireflies that don't flash, and these are known as dark fireflies. They use pheromones, chemical scents that the female puts out into the air to find each other. So this is an example of one, Lucidota atra is the species name. It's also known as the black firefly or woodland Lucy. And I found this at an Almond Trout Preserve, and this is a really good example. This is a male of the species, and it has these really gigantic, elongated, flattened antenna, and these are designed to allow it to find those pheromones in the air and sense them and smell them, essentially, and find the female that's putting them out so that they can find a mate. Because these guys don't use flashes, they also tend to be more active in the daytime than the ones that use flashes that need dark for those flashes to show up. So you'll often find these fireflies crawling around on leaves in the bright sunlight because they don't need the darkness to function. So I'm going to stop here for questions really quick. Feel free to type them in. Okay, questions about attracting fireflies to the yard. I'm going to touch on that in the last section. So hold tight on that question. How long is the pupa? It was not very long. Probably about as long as my pinky joint. I mean, it was not very big at all. Do larvae eat their eggs? Yeah, in some species they do. That's actually very typical to a lot of insects. The egg casing is a particular rich source of protein. And so in a lot of insect species, as soon as they come out of the egg, they turn around and eat the egg casing that they've left behind. Why do the larvae and the pupa light up? So again, I think that's really just a function of the capabilities of the firefly themselves, and that's what they're designed to do as an adult. It's what makes them unique, and part of it, honestly, we don't know why they'll do that even when their adults don't flash and have that capability. Why do fireflies not bite us? Probably mostly because they can't get a grip on us in most cases. Our skin is actually pretty tough, and they're working at a level that's, think about earthworms and snails and things like that. They're a little bit softer than our skin tends to be, and so they can puncture that a little bit more easily. I also probably think that it has to do with a lot of those invertebrates underground kind of have a mucus coating around them. And I have a feeling that the fireflies probably sense that a little bit more and know that that's a potential prey than we have on our hands. Somebody asked, do all beetles have head shields? No, they don't actually. And that's what makes fireflies somewhat unique and one of the defining characteristics of what makes them a firefly. There are a few other beetles that do have them, but they don't glow. So it's that combination of things. Gonna talk about the number of species in a second, so hold on that. Are they nocturnal or around during the day? So they are around during the day. Mostly the ones that need dark to flash are going to be hiding under leaves, in leaf litter, in the grass, that kind of thing, and they don't really get active until it gets dark. If they're disturbed, they will fly to find a safe spot, but for the most part, they're nocturnal, except for the dark ones that don't use glows to communicate with each other. Can I find larvae? Where would I look? So yes, you can actually find larvae. In the soils of your garden are probably the best place. We're going to talk about one particular species in a minute that actually is on trees. And that is sometimes a little bit easier to find. But if you're digging up your garden, oftentimes there are firefly larvae in there. You just need to sort of know what to look for, and the pupa as well. So the one that I showed you, that pink one, that's actually one of the very common fireflies to our area and in what's in most people's backyards. So you're going to find things that look like that. Under logs, under rocks in your yard, or in the woods, edges of woods and things like that. Gonna talk about fireflies outside of the US in a second, so hold on that one. How long do they live start to finish? So anywhere from a year to 2 years start to finish, plus a little bit for the adult, 3 weeks of the adult life. So yeah, it's in the South, they sometimes live much shorter than that, like the pupal and larva stages. The larva stage definitely in the South, like in Florida and Texas, doesn't take as long because it's warm all year round. But yeah, a little over a year to 2 years, depending on the species, from start to finish. So the poison that they have basically just acts as a neurotoxin. So it actually causes an imbalance in the sodium pumps that work in cells. And so it's really, it causes some weird chemical reactions that cause sodium to pump out of cells where it shouldn't be doing that. And so it causes problems for the animals. Okay, I am going to, a lot of the questions that I'm seeing here are things that I'm going to get to in some of the next sections. So hold on to those thoughts. Somebody asks, what do fireflies eat? And so they really only eat during the larval stage, and that's when they're eating invertebrates in the ground. So like snails and earthworms and other insect larvae that they come across. As adults, except for the predatory females, they don't really eat, although there are a couple of them that will nectar at flowers occasionally, but by and large, the adult forms of the fireflies don't actually eat. So I'm gonna stop questions there for a second and get into, as soon as my slides advance. We're going to talk now about identification of fireflies. And I think this will answer a couple of the questions that some people had that I said to hold on for. So fireflies are indeed found all over the world. They are on all continents except Antarctica, and they are in all 50 states except Hawaii. And I have honestly no idea why they're not in Hawaii, but they are not. For the most part, you can see by this chart that the darker green colors, this is the number of fireflies reported, the species, sorry, not numbers of fireflies, the species that are reported. The darker green is this 33 to 53 number of species range. And so typically the greater number and diversity of species tends to be found in humid or damp environments. Excuse me. So there are fireflies out west. A lot of people think that there aren't fireflies in the western part of the United States. There are actually fireflies in the western part of the United States. It's just that the dark, non-lantern ones that are more day active tend to be the ones that predominate in the west. And in the east, we have a predominance of the flashing ones, although we have day active dark ones, and they have a few flashing ones as well. So In Pennsylvania, we are in this 27 to 32 firefly species reported. And the reason that there is a range, and this is a really good place to stop and talk about this, and to talk a little bit about some of the difficulties with identification of fireflies. So it is actually possible, and you'll see as we go through the next sets of slides, it is possible to identify individual species of fireflies. However, I'm only going to talk about identification at a really high level tonight, not so much all the way down to the species level, because there's a lot of very specific details that are important and just way too much detail for this kind of presentation and for tonight. So I'm going to talk about species or identification sort of at a higher genus level. The other complicating factor in this is that, and part of the reason why there's like these ranges here, is that we don't actually know a lot about some of these species of fireflies, and the firefly taxonomy and understanding their relationships and how they're named is really confusing. And so it's sometimes hard to even know if some of these things are their own species. They might actually be parts of the same species, just behaving in a slightly different way, given the environment that they're in. So something in Pennsylvania, for example, might actually be the same species as something in Florida, but they have a slightly different flash characteristic. So they've been classified as two different species. And there hasn't been a ton of research on fireflies to understand the taxonomy and the species associations and things like that. And it is an area of ongoing active research by a number of researchers. And this is also why some of the citizen science projects that we'll talk about at the end are important, because that can really help contribute to understanding exactly what species are where. And so that's really important. At the end of the presentation, in the additional resources, I will give you some information about how to go a little bit deeper on species identification, and if it's something that you're interested in and wanting to go a little bit deeper, then I go tonight. So that being said, so here are some of the main genuses that we have in our area, and this is the eastern United States and Canada, and by and large there's some of this genus everywhere, including in Pennsylvania. All of these will be represented in Pennsylvania to some degree. Within each of these genuses, there's a number of different species that fall under them. And so I'm mostly going to talk about these at the genus level, but a couple species I will point out in specific. So this chart over here on the side just gives you an idea. When I say large, medium, small, or tiny, like it says here, this is kind of the size range that we're talking about. So the large ones tend to be a little bit bigger than a ½ inch long, and the tiny ones go down to 0.2 inches or 4 to 6 millimeter range. So pretty small. So Photorus, we're going to start here on the top left. Photorus is one of the more common species or genus around. These guys tend to be medium to large size, and they usually have a greenish flash. Sometimes they can have what's called a flicker or a glow. So fireflies, and we'll talk more about flash characteristics in a minute, but basically fireflies either flash and like on and off, or they might have a flicker where they do a rapid series of flashes and our eyes actually perceive that as a flickering kind of a light. Or they might glow. So they kind of turn their lantern on and they fly across the sky and they kind of leave a glowing trail behind them. Photinus is another very common species. So they kind of come in two forms. They have a large form and a small form. You can see over here on the right-hand side in the top row. And if you've ever caught a firefly in your yard, you have caught this one right here. This Photinus pyralis, this is also known as the Big Dipper or the J stroke, and we'll talk about why in the next couple of slides. But this by far is the most common one that we have in our backyards, in areas where you would, a soccer field, baseball field, where you would catch a firefly. Some of the other ones, so the Pyractomina, this one here, the second in on the top row, these are actually fairly common. They flash, tend to be an orange or a yellow flash. They tend to stay at the top of treetops though. So we see their flashes, but we don't really catch them very often because they're just too high. Or they tend to like marshes, which makes them difficult to get to. Dropping down to the bottom row here. So here's the examples of the dark fireflies. So we already talked really quickly about the Lucidota. Here, this is the example similar to the one I showed you earlier. This does not actually glow. And the Pyropega over here does not glow either. The Phoceus, which is this one in the middle, these guys tend to be on the smaller side as well. They actually light up and sort of glow as they're moving or stay stationary and just glow. They don't actually sort of flash on and off. And then this really interesting one over here, this is the Elychnia. This is what's also known as the winter firefly. These guys actually live on trees, and the adults will stay on colony trees over the winter. And one of the trees that they use tends to be tulip poplars, which we have a ton of in our area. So a good one to kind of check out carefully in the winter, looking at large crevices or cracks in the bark, you might be lucky and find a colony of these guys overwintering. These are the ones also that their larval stages tend to crawl up and down tree trunks. And so they're a little bit easier to find, at least in theory, than some of the other ones that live underground all the time. So these are, because these guys overwinter as adults, they tend to be one of the earliest ones to appear in the spring, but they're dark. They don't have a lantern, so we won't see them flashing, but we will see them flying around sometimes. And often they're gone by June. So the adults that have overwintered expend the rest of their life cycle mating and laying eggs, and then they die, and so the eggs hatch, and then the larvae spend the next few months, you know, becoming even over to the next year kind of a thing, becoming adult fireflies again. So we often don't see them after June. And then the one last thing that often gets categorized in firefly terminology, and you may have heard this, is glowworms. And unfortunately, glowworms has become sort of this catch-all term for a number of different things, some of which are fireflies and some of which aren't. So glowworms can refer to the flightless females of some species. Excuse me. So in some species, the females do not actually ever grow wings or fly. They spend all of their time on the ground, and they respond to males by glowing, flashing in some cases, and the males will fly to find them. Glowworms can also generically refer to all firefly larvae, which I said earlier, they all glow. So technically they're all glowworms. Glowworms can also refer to this thing called a railroad worm, which there's a picture of here. This is what it looks like in daylight, but it has these glowing characteristics to it. This is actually an adult that does this, not a larva, and it looks like railroad tracks is why it got the name. It's not actually a firefly. It's closely related to them, but it doesn't actually get a head shield. I don't actually think the larvae of these guys glow. I think it's more just the adults even too. So they are closely related, but if you hear the term glowworm, know that it can be referring to any number of things. So this is another good place. I think I kind of already mentioned this, but a number of fireflies do not have common names. And so that's why they tend to be referred to by their scientific names. And don't let that put you off, because they're not that hard to learn. And once you get the genuses down, you can you start seeing some of the characteristics of them. And well, one of the ways that you tell them apart is by the differences in what their pronotum looks like. So you can see if you look at this Photurus here, it's very red. It kind of has a dark spot at the front and a dark spot at the back that are interrupted, versus the Lucidota has this solid black line that kind of goes down the middle of its shield. This has, you know, the Photinus here, the larger one, has no black at the back. So it's some of those little characteristics that, if you can actually have a firefly in your hand, will help you to understand the differences in the species. Size is one of them. A lot of the fireflies, if you're familiar with catching them, they have these pale white-ish, yellowish edges on their wings. The dark fireflies tend to not have that. They tend to be all black on their wings, and they don't have those yellow stripes on them. So things like that can help you learn the differences in the species. And the genus is at the very least. I mentioned this already a little bit, but yes, different genuses of fireflies can flash different colors. And this can be sort of a very general means of identification, and might, in some cases, get you down to just limiting your choices to pick from. Understand that the color that we see is impacted by our own eyesight, and it's also impacted by our distance to the firefly that's flashing. So if something's closer to us, it's going to be easier, or the color may look different than when it's much further away. And in general, young eyes are better at picking out the color differences than older eyes are. It's just one of those things as we age. But in general, the Photinus species tend to give off this sort of yellow glow. The Photurus species is more green. And then there are a few species that have, this is the Pyractomina. They tend to be more orange, sometimes almost even red appearing. And then the, I forgot to write down in my notes what this one is. There are a few that have a more, a slightly different greener glow than the Photurus. And from a distance, and you can kind of see it on the edges of here, if you're able to see blue and green, this can actually look blue from a distance. So there's a few fireflies that are referred to as having a blue flash. It's not actually blue, but it appears that way from a distance. So the other thing about, and this is how it's actually easiest to tell fireflies apart in our own backyards or where we can see them, is fireflies flash in different patterns. And so different species use different patterns to communicate. And that combined with the different colors, and sometimes they even make shapes, if you will, depending on how they turn their flash on or off when they're moving. And you can use that to help you identify. So what you need to be able to do this is patience. So either count true seconds, 1 1,000, 2 1,000, or you need a stopwatch. But it is important to understand how long a particular flash lasts and how many seconds are in between when that firefly flashes again. So these two charts are just a couple of different ways of how different authors and different sources represent this. I personally find the flash patterns on the left more useful because this kind of gives you a little bit more information, in my opinion, than just the rectangles do. But some sources will use only, we'll use this. And there's nothing wrong with this. Again, it's just the one on the right, it's just a different format. But this is a number of different species here and some fairly common species. So if you remember earlier, I said, if you've caught a firefly in your backyard, you've caught the Big Dipper or the J firefly. Well, that's because it actually does make a J with its glow. And if you've ever stopped and slowed down enough to actually watch a single firefly, when it glows, it actually sort of makes this J-shaped check mark in the air as it's flashing. Its flash is less than a second long, and it takes about 5 to 6 seconds to flash again. And it will generally move from location to location before it flashes again. And these guys are really easy to start to learn how to see that and pay attention to it, because they tend to come out before it's dark outside. So they tend to come out when it's still light enough to actually see the firefly itself and not just its glow. So you can find a firefly and watch it flash and see if that's the right species and time it and check it. And it's a good way of learning, because pretty much these guys are everywhere. But some of the other ones that you could potentially come across, I actually saw one in my backyard that has a triple flash. And so it's like this one here, the second from the bottom, that is, but instead of 2, it has 3. And so it does 3 really quick flashes, and then it pauses for several seconds, and it moves in a straight line, and it does 3 more little flashes, and then pauses for a few more seconds. And it's called the variable triple flash. Very exciting name. I do not remember the scientific name right off. That one actually has a common name. That makes sense. So it is a way for you to start to learn, and I'm going to give you some more information on where to find information on the flash patterns. But this is part of the way that you can tell different species apart. The other thing that you can use in some cases is time of year is important. So remember, I said the Elychnia, the winter fireflies, are out really early in the spring, and then they're gone by June. So time of year is important. Time of season is important. Our most active time is about now. July is kind of the period of the most fireflies in our area. But some species are early and some species are later. Where they flash from, so treetops versus down at your lawn level, different species tend to stratify in different places. And so the ones that stay up in the top of the trees often is a good clue to look for a different flash pattern than you would see down on your lawn. And then the time of night, as I said, also matters. Some come out really early when there's still a lot of light in the sky. Some will not come out at all until it is very dark in the sky, like an hour or more after sunset. And it needs to be very dark in the sky for them to start flashing. Something to keep in mind as well, flash patterns can be impacted by temperature. So there can be a little bit of variability. Sometimes they can flash faster in warmer weather and slower in cooler weather, but they still tend to follow the same general pattern. And what that looks like in real life, and this is an example of somebody online that did this, so I can't tell you what all species these are exactly. This is from someplace up in Canada. But what you can see, and this, I have tried this photography technique. It is rather difficult. I'm going to continue to try it and improve. But if done right, you can actually see that there are a number of different species in this picture. So these really long ones, these are ones that, like I said, sometimes they glow rather than flash on and off. So this is probably the same firefly moving with its lantern lit this whole time, versus some of these singular ones here in the middle, where you see a number of smaller dots sort of connected in a line. That's that flashing as it's moving through space. Maybe it's flashing once a second. You can see some of the ones here that have a more orange or almost red kind of flash to them. And so this is something that it's hard to represent this to you with, in real time, but it is actually something it sounds complicated to see in real life. It's not. You might not know the species that you're seeing, and that's okay. Just to take the time to slow down and acknowledge that you are seeing different species and they're not all the same thing. It's really cool when you see that. We did a firefly walk last summer at Armentrout, and we were able to figure out, based on flash patterns, that we saw at least 4, if not 5 or 6 different species of fireflies while we were out there. Again, we didn't know exactly what they were, but we were actually able to see some with a red flash or orangey flash, some yellow, some green, and then the different flash patterns. So I encourage you to slow down, take some time, and really look for those kinds of differences because they are out there and in places that you might not expect. My yard is in downtown Norristown, and there's still, you know, several species of fireflies out there. So they're around if you look for them. You may have heard of the idea of synchrony or synchronous fireflies. The greatest population of these that's known in our area tends to be the ones in the Great Smoky Mountains. Those are the ones that people know about. And in these species, basically all of the males in an area will all flash at the same time. So you get this, you know, very spectacular light show. And what happens is they basically all turn on and they do their flash pattern. And in the species that operates in the Great Smoky Mountains and also in Pennsylvania at the Allegheny National Forest, it's the same species. It's Photinus carolinus. They flash 6 times really fast and then they stop. They all go dark for about 6 seconds. So they do those 6 quick flashes in about 3 seconds and they all do it at the same time and then they all go dark. Scientists, and then they repeat. Scientists do not understand why they do this. They're not entirely sure why or what benefit it gives the insects. When you think about the fact that they're trying to use this to attract a mate, and if all of them are flashing at the same time, it is not entirely clear how that works to benefit an individual firefly. The only thing that one leading hypothesis is that since they are not the only firefly in the area, so if, for example, in the Great Smoky Mountains, the species that is synchronous is one of about 19 species that are found in that area. In Pennsylvania, it's one of about 15 species that are found in that exact same area. So the theory is that the synchronous flashing benefits the whole species over an individual male. So it makes it really clear to the females of these species that here's all the males, so come find us, find one of us. And it's sort of the good of the order rather than an individual firefly trying to flash to attract a mate. But there may be other reasons, we don't really know. So I will say both of these areas in non-COVID years have viewing that you can go do to see these fireflies. It is extraordinarily popular, so popular that Great Smoky Mountains Park no longer sells tickets. They sell a ticket to a lottery, and you have to buy a ticket to put your name in a lottery. It's like $1 charge. It's not a huge fee. But basically you have to put your name in a hat to be drawn to have the right to buy a ticket to get into the viewing because it is so popular. And they are trying to minimize the impact of people on these fireflies. So they don't want people going off trail. They don't, you know, all of those kinds of things that comes with having large groups of people in an area and in a natural area. So it is possible to see them. You just have to take your chances and work really hard to try to get your name in that list. In Pennsylvania, the species is the same as the one in the Great Smoky Mountains. The population was only discovered in 2012, so relatively recently. It is in an area, unfortunately, that's used for logging and gas drilling, heavily used for logging and gas drilling, although it is somewhat protected now because of this, so finding this population. What that says to us is there are probably other populations out there that are doing synchronous flashing. We just haven't found them yet. And you can go to see these as well in non-COVID years. June is actually the best time to see the synchronous ones. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to go to PA Firefly Festival website and get on their mailing list and get more information for when that may happen in the future if that's something that you would be interested in going to see. I myself have never seen it. It is something that I would like to do. I think it would be really fantastically awesome to be out there and surrounded by thousands of fireflies lighting up at the exact same time. So if you read our description of our program, Pennsylvania state insect is actually the firefly. It was adopted in 1974. The state was petitioned by a number of Upper Darby Elementary School students when they found out that Pennsylvania did not actually have a state insect, and they decided that it should be the firefly. And so the state insect is generically referred to as the firefly. The official species that was adopted as a state insect is the Photurus pennsylvanica, which was named before Pennsylvania adopted it. So this played a role in the adoption of this particular species. This also is known as its common name as either the Pennsylvania firefly or the dot dash firefly. And the dot dash refers to how it flashes. So it has almost a Morse code like flash where it does a really quick dot flash, very short, and then it's followed by a longer dash flash that lasts 1 to 3 seconds long. And then the pattern is repeated again after 4 to 5 seconds. This is not a particularly rare firefly, but it is one that you are unlikely to see in your backyard for a couple of reasons. One is this is one of the ones that likes to fly later at night, so full dark, and an hour or more after sunset, which in the summertime can be 10 o'clock or later to get really full dark. And this flies to about midnight. So a lot of us give up on watching fireflies by that point, to be honest with you. So we wouldn't likely see it. But even if you do stay up that late to see what comes out, this particular species likes freshwater tidal marshes or wetlands or swamps. It will sometimes come out into floodplain areas. So if you happen to live in some of the areas along the floodplain of the creek, you might be lucky enough to see this, but this one has a very, very, very strong association with water. And unless you live near one of those water sources, you are unlikely to see this one. It pretty much stays in the immediate area of the marshes and the water. But if you are in an area that has a wetland or something like that, and you have the opportunity to look for it, it's fairly common around this area. And this flash pattern is really easy to identify, and it's green in color, which makes it a little bit different than some of the other ones, the yellow ones that we're kind of used to seeing. So it is very distinctive if you're in the right habitat. So I'm going to stop here for questions really quickly. Let's see what we've got here. Somebody asks, is the flash pattern of common fireflies chart publicly available? It is, and it's one that is actually used as part of the citizen science project that I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. So we'll come back to that one. Impact on the yard and garden, nice. They use slugs. So it's, it is actually good that they eat earthworms, because if something didn't eat the earthworms would take over underground, and that's not a good thing either. So it's kind of, again, it's everything in balance. And so they are really important from the standpoint of helping keep those populations of soil dwelling invertebrates in check in our lawns and garden areas. And they can be really helpful in that respect. In fact, in our area, and probably in broader areas around the East Coast and possibly even across the United States, although I'm not entirely sure about that, a number of the earthworm species that we have are actually not native species. They've been either introduced intentionally because we thought they were going to have a benefit to the garden, like aerating soil and those kinds of things, or they've been released accidentally by coming in plant shipments and things like that. And a lot of those non-native species are kind of out of control in some areas. And because of the way earthworms eat, they have a tendency to remove all of the leaf litter from an area. Part of what they help do, earthworms in general, is help recycle that carbon that's fallen in the form of leaves and lands in the soil and starts decomposing, and earthworms help churn that back into the soil. The problem is when there's too many of them, they eat all of the leaf litter. And that is not beneficial for the rest of the insects that need to live in there. You saw me talk about earlier, a number of the fireflies larvae live in the leaf litter. And so having that all gone by earthworms is not a good thing. So it's everything in balance. Everything, you know, is working to keep things in check. So, somebody says we've seen notice fireflies high into the trees and leaves. Usually we see them closer to the ground. I would say basically you've just identified your first different species for whatever it is, because most of the ones that stay higher tend to be a different species than the ones that are lower to the ground. How far into the summer can we see them around here? Usually into the beginning of August, but their numbers do start to drop off a little bit. And again, the species diversity tends to be greater around like the end of June into early July, but some of that is temperature dependent. So if we have a really cold, wet spring, we might see them a little bit later than we would in a summer that starts out really warm and stays warm all the way from the spring. How do they survive freezing temps? They just dig down deeper and go dormant. And like a lot of things that live in the soil under, you know, the ground, they just put themselves into a dormant state. They don't really hibernate as we think of it with mammals, but it's not dissimilar to that. And basically they just, yeah, they don't eat, they just go, you know, dormant. So I'm going to switch now to talking about threats and conservation. So a couple people have asked if fireflies are declining, and the short answer is we think so. The problem is with a lot of insects that we don't have good baseline numbers because people didn't study them that way. So we don't really know what the population numbers of fireflies look like, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that they are declining in numbers. And that is the same that we're seeing with a lot of other species of insects. And a lot of the reasons are the same. Some of them are particularly unique to fireflies. So it is an area that scientists continue to study. And this is also why helping to participate in some of the citizen science projects can help researchers understand what the numbers actually look like today. So a couple of different threats, 3 key threats to fireflies right now: habitat loss, light pollution, and pesticides. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those really quickly. So habitat loss, obviously there's the big issue of loss of open space to development and those kinds of things. But on a smaller scale, things like reduction in leaf litter that can be reduced by invasive invertebrates, earthworms, and deer overbrowsing, and those kinds of things. And even in our own yards at a very small habitat level, we have a tendency to remove all of the leaf litter from our yards to keep our yards clean and neat and protect our grass from growing, or to be able to grow. And so all of those things at a very small habitat level can impact numbers of fireflies. In addition, disruption to the ground. We said, you know, the larval form of a lot of fireflies spends 1 to 2 years underground. And so disruptions by mowing, those kinds of things can be harmful to the larva, can be harmful to the pupa, and can be harmful to the flightless fireflies that can't escape. Light pollution is another key issue. This is a picture from the International Space Station in 2017. This is essentially the I-95 corridor. So up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is Hartford, Connecticut. This biggest, brightest circle down here on the left, this is Philadelphia. And this is the I-95 corridor through New York City, Newark, New Jersey, and then across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. And you can see the massive amount of light that is visible at night in this area. And so light has two main issues for fireflies. So one is the cumulative effect of so many lights being on at night causes what's called increased sky glow. And so in other words, the sky never really gets dark in populated areas. And so that can have an impact on fireflies' ability to attune to their natural rhythms. Like I said, some of the ones don't want to come out unless it's full dark. And so if there's an area where there's a lot of light contributing to this increased level of sky glow and the sky never really gets dark, that firefly is probably going to go try to find someplace else to live because it's not going to be able to function with that much glow in the sky. And then there's the direct impacts that artificial lights in an environment, so street lights and house lights and car lights can have on an insect that relies on creating their own light to signal mates or ward off predators. And so in areas where there are more artificial lights, scientists have shown that there tend to be less fireflies in those areas, and they can actually change the numbers of flashes that they show because of having so many lights in the area. And so that can impact their ability to find a mate and reproduce, and could impact whole species levels of fireflies. And then the last big category, and this is probably one of the key ones for all insects right now, and especially fireflies, is pesticides. And both herbicides and insecticides can play a role here. The herbicides is more of a sublethal effect, if you will, where some of the insects or some of the invertebrates that the fireflies are feeding on may have fed on something that was treated with an herbicide, and so they are then contaminated, and then the firefly becomes contaminated. Obviously, insecticides is a direct effect. Insecticides by definition are designed to kill insects, but even that can have direct and indirect impacts. So directly, it can kill the adult fireflies or any stage of the firefly development. But indirectly, it also contaminates their food supply because the food supply has ingested the chemicals. So, for example, one study found that treating a lawn to remove white grubs, and white grubs have a tendency to be Japanese beetle grubs. They're not all Japanese beetle grubs, but they tend to be, and that's why we tend to treat our yard, is to get rid of Japanese beetles before they come out. Treating a yard to remove white grub reduced non-target species, including beetles, which we've established that fireflies are, by 50% or more over 3 years. So the larva just simply cannot survive. The same impacts that that chemical has on the grubs will also kill larvae of the fireflies. And even chemical fertilizers that we use can have an impact. So things that we put on our yard lawn to make it greener and grow better, they tend to add salt to the soil, and that salt negatively impacts soil dwelling slugs and snails and worms, and so it reduces the prey that the firefly larvae have available to them. So if they can't find something to eat, they're going to move to another area. So ways that we can combat this, I have no idea why I have all this drawing all over my screen. I'm sorry if you're seeing that. Making your yard make your yard friendly, because you're not just going to be making it friendly for fireflies, you're actually going to be making it friendly for a lot of insects, which, given the general declines in insects that we've seen in the last number of years, is not a bad thing. Insects are really important in our environment. The larval and caterpillar stages of a lot of them are really important food sources for birds, and other parts of the food web. And so we really do need insects in our life. I think I know I grew up thinking insects were bad, even as somebody who was interested in nature and the outdoors. You know, insects were just not something that you wanted to deal with, and they were pests and nuisances. And the reality is they're really not. And we probably really need to take a second look at how we think about insects and their importance in our environment. So one of the key things that you can do is leave the leaves. This is a campaign that the Xerces Society ran the last couple of years. You've probably seen social media from us with these kinds of logos on them, leave the leaves. And it is really important, not just for fireflies, but like I said, a lot of different insects. So rake the leaves into your garden and let them decompose naturally. Let them become your mulch for the next season. Sometimes people want to shred them with the lawnmower to make them break down a little bit faster, and that's okay. But I wouldn't recommend shredding all of them every year. Only shred some of them, because some of the larvae are actually in those leaves. And so if you shred them all, you have a chance of actually killing those larvae that are in there. Obviously, you know, my soapbox, no pesticides or extremely limited use of them as a last resort. Talking about specific things that you can do for your gardens is really beyond the scope of tonight, but I will encourage you to go look at the Xerces Society website. They have a ton of information on a lot more of the bad effects than I talked about here, so that you can really understand what the issues are. But the other thing that they have is a lot of information on how to use more friendly things to deal with problem pests like Japanese beetles, for example, and things like that. So I really encourage you to go check out their website. They have a ton of information about this. This is their mission in life, is to protect insects. And so they've got a lot of resources there for you to use. The other thing that you can do is reduce your lawn. So expand your garden areas out, even by a couple of feet in areas is going to make a huge amount of difference in the amount you have to mow, the amount that you're going to be going over with a lawnmower all the time, and gives planting that area with native plants, and use some species of different heights, and you're going to provide more cover for the fireflies to use during the daytime. And you're going to provide more sort of perches for them to advertise from at night for the females who don't fly. So getting them out of your lawn and into a native garden area can be helpful for them to be able to advertise themselves to the males in the area. This also has the impact of giving some more undisturbed area for the larva and the pupa to live. So and more area to leave your leaves in the fall. So think about expanding your garden. I know for a lot of us, we can't, either with kids or pets or ordinances, in some cases from the township or community organizations, that we can't like completely remove all of our lawn. But even if you can expand the edges of your garden by a foot, then you're going to get a lot more area for these things to live a little bit more naturally than in our lawns. Think about including some logs or some stones in your garden areas to act as additional cover. And logs tend to decompose over time, and they attract a certain set of insects, which often tend to be insects that the fireflies will eat. So when you do mow, consider trying to mow less often if you possibly can. Push it, you know, to the absolute extreme of how high your grass has to grow before you mow it. And also consider setting your blade a little bit higher when you do mow. And that gives some of the larvae that might be in the lawn, or the flightless females, or even the males that are just resting in the lawn for the day, a chance to get out of the way or, you know, not be impacted as heavily. And then the last thing is to work to make your exterior lighting less disruptive, especially in the summertime when fireflies are active. So the light in your yard in December really isn't going to matter. So times of the year when it gets, you know, because of our clock changes and it gets dark earlier and all that kind of stuff, that's not so much what we're talking about. I'm talking about now, you know, May through August, the kind of times. There's some tips here. Again, the Xerces Society has a lot of tips that you can look at and get more information, but things like turning off the lights that you aren't using, or lights that only serve a cosmetic purpose. So like if you have lights on your trees or on your facade, those especially are extremely disruptive because they tend to point up into the sky and contribute to that sky glow. So if you do have to have lights outside for safety purposes, to light a walkway, those kinds of things, limit it and opt for styles that point that light down and away from the sky, because anything that has a cover on it and points it down is going to help reduce that sky glow. Use motion detectors if you can, so the lights can actually be off most of the time unless they're absolutely needed. Placing lighting down low on the ground can actually also help reduce the lit area. So if you have to light a walkway, rather than having lights 6 feet up in the air, if you can have lights down at the walkway level, that's actually a lot less light polluting, and still allows you to have a walkway lit up safely. Use a dimmer if you possibly can. A lot of outside lights don't necessarily let us do that, but if you can, and keep it at the lowest acceptable intensity for when it's on. And then the other thing to consider is to replace the lights with either red lights themselves, or use red gels over the covers of them to reduce the bright blue-white LED lights. And that's less disruptive to fireflies. The other thing that you can do is close your curtains at night so that the light you're using inside isn't going out and sort of contributing to that general lighted view that the fireflies are seeing. So the last section here really quickly is citizen science, and I'm going to start that off with talking about enjoying fireflies. So yeah, absolutely, go outside, catch some fireflies, look at them up close, carefully, gently, and if you are going to catch them, please do not have insect repellent on your hands. We want to release them back into the environment in as healthy a state as possible. You can put them in a container. I would recommend that you put a very damp paper towel in the bottom of the container. It just keeps the humidity levels kind of high in there, and helps them sort of acclimate a little bit better. But we practice catch and release. So if you catch them that night, you need to release them that night, and you need to release them in the same area that you caught them in. So if you go to a park and you catch fireflies, please release them back into that park. Don't take them home and release them at your house. They were designed, they were reared to be where they are. So, and they tend not to move very far from where they were laid as eggs and hatched as larvae and pupa. So keep them in the same general area. So these are the kinds of things that are going to just help us return healthy firefly populations back into the wild after we've had a chance to look at them. And like I said earlier, just spend some time observing. See if you can spot different flash patterns or different colors. Look for the stationary females that might be responding to males. So look, along the edges of shrubs and see if there's a flash that's not moving. Look in your grass. You will often see a firefly down actually in the grass. And that's often a female that's responding to a male. And particularly those big dippers that are in our backyards, you can often see, once you find a female, several males sort of in that vicinity trying to, catch her attention, so to speak, and waiting for her to flash her response. So slow down, take some time, just really pay attention, and you may see more than you expect to see. You do not need to put food into the container. As we established, most adults don't eat, but do be aware that if you do catch a predatory female, she may attack the other fireflies in the container. And honestly, there's no real way to know whether you've got a predatory female unless it happens. So just keep that in mind. Nature is nature. So And then the last thing is, for best viewing, if you're in your backyard, turn your lights out, because your eyes are going to dark adapt and you're going to see way more than you would if the lights were on. And it's obviously, as it's just said, it's better for the fireflies if it's dark out there when they're trying to flash. And covering your flashlights or your headlamps with a red film, like a red cellophane. Coke bottles for some size flashlights can work really well, like a red Coke cap. You can just kind of slide it over the top and attach it with a rubber band. And that's going to help protect your night vision as well as make things better for the fireflies. And so this is an old stargazing trick. So you can actually still see with a red light on your flashlight. So this is a star map here that somebody's out in the field looking at. So this is a really good way of protecting your own night vision. Two quick citizen science projects I want to talk about. The Massachusetts Audubon Firefly Watch. It's a free program. You create a free account. All the training is on their website. And basically you observe 10 minutes once a week during firefly season in your backyard or a nearby field. And you don't have to identify things down to a species level. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to count the number of flashing fireflies as well as the number of different flash patterns that you see. And that's it. And you submit the information back to them. And I believe that's all online. I actually haven't started doing this yet. I need to do it myself this summer. So it's not complicated. It's relatively easy. And that Firefly flash chart is the one that's on their website, the one that I like. So you can use that as a guide for your own backyard, even if you choose not to use to participate in the Citizen Science Project. That's where that flash chart is. And then for all of you iNaturalist users out there, there is a project on iNaturalist called Fireflies of the USA and Canada. As far as I can tell, you do not have to do anything special to participate in this project. If you put an observation in that falls within the taxa that they are getting information on, which is basically anything that's a firefly, it will go into their project. And so that's a really great reason to contribute to iNaturalist, because that project's going on in the background. And so you're contributing to that without doing anything extra. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay with iNaturalist. Stay tuned. I will be doing a program like this about iNaturalist shortly. And so you can tune in to get more information. If you don't already use this, it's a great app and a great program to get involved in. To collect information on the natural world around us. And a couple of additional resources that are available. So 2 books. Silent Sparks is a hardback book, a wonderful book, very well written, and it's a very in-depth look at fireflies around the world. She talks about some of the fireflies in other parts of the world, not just the ones here. Goes very in-depth information about bioluminescence. So if that's something, and it's not like it's not real chemistry oriented, but it goes much deeper than I talked about here in understanding sort of what we know about the hows and whys. So if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend that book. If you're wanting more something just like a field guide, this middle book, The Fireflies, Glowworms, and Lightning Bugs, is another great one. This covers the fireflies of the eastern and central United States and Canada. And I actually happen to bring my copy with me here because there's no way that I can put this on a slide that makes any kind of coherent sense. But hopefully if I hold this up, you can see this. You might not be able to because I'm screen sharing. This is the flash chart that's in the front of the book. I will show this again when I stop screen sharing so you can see it, but it covers 75 plus species and their flash charts. And then this last one here, Conserving the Jewels of the Night, is a Xerces Society publication, has a little bit more in-depth information about some of the threats and conservation that I talked about tonight. Again, a really just a great guideline document for how to protect fireflies, and along with some of the other information on their website about native gardening and all of those kinds of things. It's going to be really helpful for creating a more natural environment in your own yard, and that's really the best thing that you can do to encourage fireflies to be in your area is to be as natural as possible and limit the use of chemicals. And then last but not least, so if you remember earlier, I had the pupa that I found under the pot in my backyard, and I put it in a plastic container because I wanted to see what would happen, because being the naturalist that I am, this is what I do. And lo and behold, it actually turned into a firefly. It was sitting in my mudroom in its container in the dirt for a couple of days, and then the firefly came out. So you can see the shed pupal skin here. So this is like the spent chrysalis of a butterfly. And here's the fully adult firefly. You can see it looks a little light. Its wings aren't completely dried out. They'll elongate a little bit as it dries out. Butterflies do this as well. They have to pump some fluid from their abdomen into the wings to get them to expand properly, because they can't be full size when they're inside the pupal casing. So, but you can see its tiny little glow spots here at the end of its tail. This is not a fully functioning lantern yet. It needs, again, some time to completely become its adult form, even though it's out of its pupal casing, and get all of those mechanisms turned on completely. So right now, this is still sort of the glow that it had from the pupa. And I took it outside and put it in the fennel to let it have a protected place to rest. And next morning when I went out, it was gone. So it became an adult, and it was really cool and a lot of fun. So, you know, if you happen to come across the pupa like that, if you have some place that you can put it that's protected, as natural as possible is best. And, you know, make sure it has some air to breathe. It doesn't need food at that point, but, you know, like raising butterflies inside and feeding the caterpillars until they become butterfly, you know, this is the same kind of thing. So it was really cool to be able to see that, and just chance that I happened to find it in the yard in time for this presentation. So that is all I have for tonight. I am going to check questions here one more time and see if anybody's got any other particular questions about fireflies. Oh yeah, Xerces Society. It's XERCES Society, and it's .org. So yeah, that's a great site to check out. Let's see. I think I answered the question about their numbers declining. I mean, we think so. It's every indication is that they are, but we don't have a really good handle on how much right now. And that's something that we continue to work to try to understand. Should I remove my solar lanterns? You know, this is one, I don't know. I haven't been able to find a lot of good information about this. I have a partner who likes to have solar lanterns out at the edges of gardens, and we have an ongoing battle of saying, no, you shouldn't have them out there because the yard needs to be dark. They are not as bright as lights that we tend to have, like floodlights and things like that. So I would say that if they're not entirely necessary, you might want to think about removing them, particularly at the key peaks of firefly season. If you need them and you're using them as safety in your walkway and those kinds of things, I would say they're probably fine, and they're less likely to be an impact than very bright LED kinds of lights. The solar lights just don't tend to get that bright. So again, something to keep in mind. Kind of thing. Should we turn off landscape lighting? Yeah, probably during the time, especially during the time of year that the fireflies are really active. That's really probably the best thing for them. And you'll see, if you've paid attention to our website, we have a moth program coming up in a couple of weeks. And if you choose to participate in that, that would be great. But you're going to hear the same thing about lights and moths because they operate in the dark. And so any kind of lighting for that, you know, that we can reduce the amount of light at night is going to help a lot of different kinds of insects that operate in the dark. Do they eat ladybugs? I honestly do not know the answer to that question. They probably do go after some of the ladybug larvae, because ladybug larvae can live in the ground just like the fireflies do. So if they encounter them, they probably would go after them. If they encountered them as adult ladybugs, I don't think so. But I'm not positive about that. So, okay, so night photography. So as some questions about, can you attract a firefly with a flashlight? Yes, actually you can, at least in theory. I've never had particular luck doing this, but it is theoretically possible, and you can search online for some more specific instructions. What I will tell you is that very small LED pen lights tend to be the most useful. The ones that have really tiny lights on them, kind of like the ones that you would attach to a keychain that are really small. Anything that's like a normal size flashlight is too big. That won't work as well. So you can do that, and you can try. Oftentimes the best thing to try is to be the male. So if you try like to do the J pattern of the ones that are typically in our backyard, you might get a female to respond to you. So that's kind of the best way to try that. So yeah. And I'm not sure I completely understand the question here about night photography and single LED to mimic the females. So for photography, it's a completely different story. And real quickly, the best way to do that is to have a camera that allows you to take long exposures. And so to get photographs of single fireflies is really hard. It's possible, but it's difficult. And you need more of a ring light macro setup to be able to do that. And it's not so much about attracting them, it's about finding them and then taking a picture of them. To get some of the pictures like the light trails that I showed you across the sky, that is taking a series of up to 50 images in some cases, and then using something like Photoshop to blend all those layers together and pull out only the bright lights of the fireflies onto sort of a base image. So it's not easy. It takes a lot of practice. I've tried several times now, and I've yet to get a picture that I'm really happy with. I will keep trying, but there's a lot more information online than I can give you here. And I would encourage, if you're interested in firefly photography, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can send you some links to some websites that are some good starting places for you to take a look at. So that is what I am going to cover tonight. So I want to say thank you to everybody for participating. Here is my, whoops, that just jumped out of there. Sorry, folks. My contact information. So if you want to send me an email, have any specific questions that come to your mind afterwards, please feel free. I'm happy to answer those questions, and please keep an eye on our website for additional programs coming up. We're working on some of those programs now. MODS is one, and as I said, iNaturalist will be one as well. So if that's something that you'd like to learn more about, please join us for that. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a really good evening.